Zimbabwe fuel protests. Protests began in Harare on January 14, 2019. In response, the police and military launched a coordinated response that involved raiding the homes of some residents. Beyond the capital, disturbances were also reported in the cities of Mutare and Bulawayo. By the end of the day, the government reported that 3 people, including 1 policeman, had died in the protests. Non-government sources reported that around 200 people had been arrested and that 8 had been killed in the protests by police. The Zimbabwe Association of Doctors for Human Rights stated that 107 people had been injured, 68 were treated for gunshot wounds. Indiscriminate acts of violence by the police on both protesters and bystanders were also reported, along with acts of looting by some protesters in Harare, Bulawayo, and Dodoma. During the protests, the government blocked access to social messaging services WhatsApp, Facebook, and Twitter. Later the government blocked all access to the internet once it was noticed that people were using VPNs to access news about the protests. The country's largest cellular provider, Econet, confirmed that the government issued a directive blocking all internet access during the protests. On the 3rd day of the protests, the civil society activist and pastor Evan Maurier was arrested. Maurier's lawyer stated that the government alleged that he incited violent protest on Twitter as the reason for the arrest. The Movement for Democratic Change, Changarai, MDCT, stated that its party leadership had been detained by security forces during the protests. The government blamed the MDCT for the protests. MDCT offices were attacked and torched during the protests, with the MDC alleging that ZANU-PF supporters were responsible. The government stated that government property and property owned by the ruling ZANU-PF party was damaged in the attacks and blamed MDC supporters. The MDC denied government accusations that they were responsible for violence committed by protesters and highlighted acts of violence committed by government forces against protesters and civilians. On 17 January in Harare, the 4th and final day of fixtures in the 2018-19 Logan Cup cricket tournament were both called off due to the protests.